by around £20 a week. On average, families spend the most on running the home for a second year running. So for this morning's debate, we're asking just what does poverty in the UK look like? Well, joining me now to discuss that are Mike Kelly, who sits on the Living Wage Commission and is KPMG's Head of Living Wage, Adam Lake from Elizabeth Finn Care, and Ryan Bourne, who's Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Before we get started, a reminder that you can join the debate too. Tweet us at Sky News, including the hashtag Sky Debate. Text on 84501 or email news@sky.com to let us know what you think, or if there are any points you want to put to our guests here, and we'll try to read out some of your comments as we go along. Let's start with Mike Kelly from the Living Wage Commission. Mike, when we look at absolute poverty, there are lots of different definitions, but that tends to be defined as people surviving on less than around $1.25 a day. That's how you define it internationally. Are there people in the UK struggling at that kind of level of poverty, as far as you're aware?
They're not struggling at that level of poverty. The introduction of the national minimum wage ensured that there was a safety net and people didn't fall into abject poverty. Where they are struggling is having enough to make ends meet and to spend time with their families. So it's that quality of life where the struggle is.
How would you then describe poverty? What is the marker for you below which somebody is living in poverty in the UK?
Well, poverty, the Living Wage Foundation, the campaign was all started in East London in 2000, when families were asked what are the pressures they're under, where are they feeling the pinch? And yes, wages were an issue, but the fundamental piece was that even with 2 or 3 jobs paying minimum wage, that families didn't have enough to make ends meet. They didn't have enough to have a decent but basic quality of life. So they couldn't spend time with their families. You couldn't buy the children a birthday present or buy presents at Christmas. So it's that type of poverty, which is relative in absolute terms.
Okay, so for you it's about a level of quality of life rather than actually putting a figure on it. Let's bring in Ryan Bourne from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Ryan, can you put a figure on it? Some people say we look at the people who exist on half of the median salary. We're hearing it's around £517 a week, half of that £258 a week. Would you say that people earning less than £258 a week are living in poverty in the UK?
Well, it totally depends on their family situation, of course. Many people have children, many people have perhaps other dependents that are in their homes, so it's very difficult to put an exact figure on it on average. What I would say is, over the past 300 years, we've seen a huge decline in that sort of absolute grinding poverty that characterised the Victorian period. Obviously, that's a great thing to celebrate. What we talk about when we think about poverty now is really a sort of relative measure, how are people able to interact with society. And I think to a certain extent, we probably all agree on this panel that is important to a degree. The problem that I have is we've become obsessed over the last 15 years or so with looking at relative poverty in terms of incomes, and actually forgotten, the real thing that matters is what people can afford to pay for with those incomes. And in many areas, we've got government policies which push up the cost of living, and then we constantly try to correct for that with more redistribution and campaigns to increase minimum wage rates. Let's focus on trying to get the cost of things down in the first place.
Let's bring in Adam Lake from the Elizabeth Finn Care. Now, you guys deal with people who are in desperate financial straits. They come to you really when they just can't cope any longer. How desperate are these people? We're talking about quality of life, about not being able, for example, to take your children to the cinema or buy presents at Christmas time. What is it that people coming to you need?
Well, we had 3 million people visit our Turn2us.org.uk website last year seeking advice on income maximisation. About half of those people who used our website said that they were cutting back on essentials. And when we say essentials, we mean things like food or heating. Anecdotally, we're dealing in situations where perhaps the mother is skipping the meal so that their children don't go hungry, or with an elderly person who perhaps is rationing their use of hot water to 1 day a week. So I think it's undeniable that poverty does exist in the UK, and that's why organisations such as us are here to address that.
Mike Kelly, isn't it about people cutting their cloth accordingly? You were talking about perhaps not being able to buy presents, not being able to buy Christmas presents. At this time of year, of course, we'd all love to be able to do that for our families, for our children. But is that truly an essential to living? As long as you have shelter, as long as you have warmth, as long as you have food, aren't those the real basics that people should worry about?
The basics have to be covered. So you need to have enough to pay the rent, you need to have enough to pay the bills, and to buy nutritious food for your family. But if you want to interact, if you want to be part of the society in which we all live, if you want to engage in your local community, then you do need additional income to do that. You also need additional income for those sorts of emergencies that happen. If you've got a major electrical appliance that breaks down and you don't have the money to replace that, then that sort of a knock can have an enormous effect on your family's finances. There's been some debate about whether or not you need access to the internet. You know, is that necessary? These days, for children in school, our members, people who are consulted about what do they think needs to be included in a living wage, say yes, you know, access to the internet is needed for children of school age. You do need a mobile phone, definitely, but you don't need a smartphone. People are quite measured in their view as to what do they need to interact in the community, to be part of their society.
Okay, let's put that up to Ryan Bourne. So Ryan Bourne, you don't need a smartphone, but you do need a mobile phone, and you do need a computer to be part of your local community. Do you think that's fair, or do you think that's a luxury?
Well, I think it's always very difficult when you look at these individual things. I mean, one of the discussions that I had with somebody this morning was whether, you know, having the money to take your children to the cinema once a month constituted a necessity. And I think people have different preferences, so trying to sort of aggregate those preferences up and come to some sort of degree of social acceptability is inherently problematic. What I would say, though, is that where I agree with the other two speakers, the cost of essentials is now so high. We saw this in the figures this morning, particularly with housing, fuel and power, that actually people are having to cut back on perhaps things that aren't strictly necessities, but would be things that would be nice to have and nice to do. The question then, the real question is, what do we do about it? I don't think yet more redistribution or, you know, trying to cajole bosses into paying higher wages divorced from economic reality is the way to go. I think we need to look at the planning laws in this country, which restrict the new build of housing and push up housing costs unnecessarily. And I think we have to re-examine energy policy, because at the moment our energy policy not only tries to sort of get carbon emissions down, which may be a viable aim, but actually subsidises very expensive energy sources. And this is having an effect of squeezing people's living standards, squeezing their real incomes, and leading to the sorts of problems that the other speakers are concerned about.
Adam, Nick, should we all be patting ourselves on the back if we are concerned about poverty in the terms of whether or not we can take our children to the cinema once a month? If we're defining that as a marker of poverty, does that not perhaps show that the UK is doing something right, and that really we're not a society that's beset with this really as a true problem any longer?
Well, I'm not so sure about taking children to the cinema, but one statistic I will say is that 50% of children who are on free school meals are missing school trips because it's seen as an unaffordable expense. Now, if children are missing out on school trips, or they can't do their homework properly because there isn't access to the internet in the home, this is all feeds into the cycle of poverty. It means, you know, what hope is there for future generations when they're missing out things, not the cinema, but missing out on school trips or being able to do their homework? I also noticed that in the ONS report, books were counted as recreation. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a world where books are counted as a luxury. These are essentials that people need in order to get themselves out of poverty in the future and get themselves the training and the jobs that they need.
They are essentials, aren't they? But Mike Kelly, haven't we all become a little bit lazy? You know, I know a lot of people complaining that libraries are being closed down. I'm lucky enough to have a great local library. My kids read voraciously, but it's all library books. They don't cost me anything. There are computers there. There are facilities out there for people if they want to access these things. Why do people need to have a computer or a laptop in their own home?
I think these are just examples of the types of expenditure that are needed to sustain a better quality of life. You do find that you do need, in addition to libraries, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate about whether we need library books or not, but what we do need is that families have a percentage or an amount of disposable income which is at their discretion to use to improve the quality of their lives, to improve the social mobility of themselves and their families, so that they can aspire to a more creative life, to more active community participation. If you're a father who hasn't got the time to help coach the local football team or to help down at the local youth club, then what happens to our community cohesion? It's that type of quality of life that we're talking about here. It's not abject poverty, because abject absolute poverty, the state does have the national minimum wage. It's very separate from the living wage. The living wage is very much about community regeneration, community cohesion. It's about skills improvement. People who are on the living wage, generally speaking, employers report back that you get better productivity, you get better staff retention. So if you're improving the skills of people, you're improving the quality of the economy as well.
Very briefly, Ryan Bourne, just back to you finally, we touched on disposable income there, and it's an interesting point, isn't it, that having disposable income gives you dignity, doesn't it? The dignity of choice, and that is something that you can't really put a price on.
No, and it increases, our options as individuals, and I think we'd all support a world in which incomes were growing. The optimistic point here is that the history of capitalism over the last 300 years is that it's delivered sustained improvements in living standards for ordinary people across the board. We've had situations where things that have previously been luxuries held by only the elites in society have trickled down to everybody over time, and I expect that to continue. But what we really need is to reassess current government policies and move to a situation where we first do no harm, because there's many areas, as I suggested, planning laws, energy policy, very high tax burden, particularly on sort of regressive indirect taxes on many people on low incomes. If we get that right, we can provide more dignity for people on low incomes, and hopefully with a dynamic growing economy, improve living standards over time.
Okay, then we'll leave it. Ryan Bourne from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Adam Lake from Elizabeth FinCare, and Mike Kelly from the Living Wage Commission. Thank you all very much. We do still want to get your thoughts on that. We'd love to know what you do with your spare